The world tilted when I saw him standing there, framed by the open door of a house I could never afford. His smile sharper than the late autumn sun cutting through the Virginia sky. I was drowning in debt, running from a past that clung like damp rot, and yet here was this man, this realtor, offering me a glimpse of something I hadn't dared to hope for, a home, and maybe something more. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and at 27, I was chasing a fresh start in a town called Willow Creek, where secrets whispered louder than the wind. I'd come to Willow Creek to escape the suffocating weight of my old life in Richmond. Parents who'd turned their backs when I came out, a job that chewed up my soul, and a string of lovers who left scars deeper than I'd admit. The house hunt was supposed to be practical, a way to ground myself in a new place. But the moment I met Lucas Harper, my realtor, practicality went out the window. He was tall, with sandy hair that caught the light like spun gold, and eyes that held a quiet storm, blue, piercing, and guarded. His handshake was firm, but there was a flicker in his gaze, like he was sizing me up for more than just a mortgage approval. "This one's a gem," Lucas said, leading me into the first house. A craftsman-style cottage with creaking floors and windows that framed the lake like a painting. His voice was smooth, professional, but there was a warmth beneath it, like he was sharing a secret. I followed him through the rooms, half listening to his pitch about square footage and recent renovations. My attention snagged on the way his hands moved, confident, deliberate, but with a slight tremor when he thought I wasn't looking. I wondered what made a man like him nervous. Me? The house? Or something else entirely? Willow Creek was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and Lucas seemed to be its golden boy. He nodded at neighbors as we toured properties, his charm effortless, his laugh easy. But I caught the cracks in his facade. How his smile faltered when a woman at the coffee shop asked if he was still single. How his shoulders tensed when a man in a pickup truck stared a little too long. I knew that look. I'd worn it myself. It was the weight of hiding, of carrying a truth you couldn't speak. By the third house, I was less interested in crown molding and more in the man showing it to me. Lucas had a way of making every room feel alive, like he was selling a dream instead of drywall. "Picture yourself here," he'd say, and I did. Except in my mind, he was there too, leaning against the counter, laughing over coffee. It was a dangerous fantasy. I'd learned the hard way not to trust charm, not to fall for someone who might not be what they seemed. But Lucas was different, or maybe I just wanted him to be. That evening, after a long day of house tours, he suggested we grab a drink at a local bar, the Rusty Anchor, to talk over your options. I agreed, ignoring the voice in my head that screamed this was more than business. The bar was dimly lit, all exposed brick and worn leather booths, the kind of place where secrets felt safe. We sat in a corner, nursing beers, and for the first time Lucas let his guard slip. He talked about growing up in Willow Creek, about his father's expectations, about the pressure to be perfect. "Small towns," he said, his voice low. "They love you until you're not what they expect." I leaned forward, my heart pounding. "And what do they expect from you, Lucas?" He looked at me then, really looked, and the storm in his eyes broke. "Someone I can't be," he said, barely above a whisper. The words hung between us, heavy with meaning I wasn't sure I was ready to unpack. I wanted to reach for his hand, to tell him I understood, but the moment passed, and he was back to talking about closing costs and school districts. I left the bar that night with a knot in my chest, knowing I was falling for a man who might be running from himself. The next day, we toured a fixer-upper on the edge of town, a sprawling Victorian with peeling paint and a porch that sagged like it was tired. Lucas was quieter than usual, his usual charm dialed back. I caught him staring at me as I ran my hand along a cracked banister, his expression unreadable. "You like things that need work, don't you?" he asked, and I laughed, but there was something in his tone, something raw, like he was talking about more than the house. "Maybe I just see potential where others don't," I said, holding his gaze. For a moment, neither of us moved, the air between us thick with unspoken words. Then his phone buzzed, shattering the moment. It was his assistant, reminding him of a meeting with another client. He apologized, promised to reschedule, but as he walked me to my car, his hand brushed mine, lingering just long enough to send my pulse racing. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my rented apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying every glance, every word. Lucas was a puzzle and I was desperate to solve him. But Willow Creek wasn't Richmond. It was smaller, tighter, a place where gossip could ruin a man. I knew the risks of wanting someone like him, someone who might not be ready to want me back. But I was already in too deep, and the houses he showed me were starting to feel like excuses to see him again. By the end of the week, I'd seen a dozen properties, but it was Lucas who kept me coming back. He was careful, always professional, but there were moments, his hand on my shoulder as he pointed out a view, the way his laugh softened when it was just us, that made me think he felt it too. I didn't know his story, not yet, but I knew enough. He was hiding something, and I was determined to find out what. Because Lucas Harper wasn't just showing me houses. He was showing me pieces of himself, whether he meant to or not. The days bled into weeks, and house hunting became a ritual that felt more like courtship than commerce. Lucas and I fell into a rhythm. Mornings spent wandering through empty homes, afternoons stealing glances over coffee, evenings where the line between client and something more blurred into dangerous territory. Willow Creek was waking up to me, the newcomer, and I could feel the town's eyes on us, curious and sharp. One crisp October morning, Lucas took me to a colonial-style house perched on a hill, its white clapboard glowing under the dawn light. The air smelled of pine and possibility, but his mood was off, distracted, his smiles forced. "Everything okay?" I asked as we stood in the empty living room, sunlight spilling through tall windows. He hesitated, then shrugged, but his eyes betrayed him. They were shadowed, heavy with something he wasn't saying. "It's nothing," he said, turning to point out the fireplace. Original stonework, 1920s. Solid. But I wasn't looking at the fireplace. I was looking at him, at the way his jaw tightened, at the way he avoided my gaze. I stepped closer, close enough to smell his cologne. Cedar and something softer, like lavender. "Lucas," I said, my voice low. "You don't have to pretend with me." He froze, his hand hovering over the mantel. For a moment, I thought he'd brush me off again. But then he turned, and the look in his eyes hit me like a punch. "You don't know what you're asking, Ethan," he said, his voice rough. "This town, it's not what you think. It's not safe to—" He stopped, swallowing hard, and I knew. I knew what he was hiding, what he was afraid of. I'd lived that fear myself. "Then tell me," I said, stepping closer still, my heart hammering. "Tell me what's not safe." But he shook his head, his walls slamming back up. He moved past me, muttering about checking the backyard, and I let him go, cursing myself for pushing too hard. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something, and one wrong move could send us tumbling. That afternoon, we ended up at the lake, a spot he'd mentioned during our first tour. It was quieter here, away from the town's prying eyes. We sat on the dock, skipping stones across the water, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. "I used to come here as a kid," Lucas said, his voice softer now. "Whenever things got bad at home, this was my place." I wanted to ask what bad meant, but I didn't. Instead, I tossed a stone, watching it skim the surface before sinking. "What was it like?" I asked instead. "Growing up here." He laughed, but it was bitter. "Like living in a glass house. Everyone's watching, waiting for you to break something." He paused, then added, "My dad wanted me to be someone I wasn't. Still does." I waited, sensing he was teetering on the edge of revelation. But then he stood, brushing off his jeans. "We should get back. Got another showing tomorrow." The next day, things took a turn. We were at a modern ranch-style house when a man stopped by, mid-40s, broad-shouldered, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Lucas, my boy," he said, clapping him on the shoulder. Still selling dreams, huh? Lucas tensed, his charm flickering like a bad light bulb. The man introduced himself as Tom, Lucas's father. The resemblance was there, same jawline, same height, but where Lucas was warm, Tom was cold, his eyes scanning me like I was a threat. New client? Tom asked, his tone too casual. Lucas nodded, his voice tight. Ethan's looking for a place to settle. Tom's gaze lingered on me, then flicked back to Lucas. Good. Keep it professional, son. The words were a warning, and I felt the air shift, like a storm was brewing. After Tom left, Lucas was quiet, his usual energy drained. I wanted to ask about his father, about the tension that crackled between them, but I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I invited him to dinner. My treat, I said, trying to lighten the mood. You've been working overtime showing me houses I can't afford. He laughed, a real one this time, and agreed. We ended up at a small Italian place, all candlelight and checkered tablecloths. Over pasta and cheap wine, he opened up again. Not about his father, but about little things. His love for old jazz records, his dream of traveling to Italy, the way he'd always wanted a dog but never had the time. I soaked it all in, every word a piece of the puzzle. As we walked back to our cars, the night air cool and sharp, he stopped under a streetlight, his face half-shadowed. Ethan, he said, his voice barely audible, why do you keep coming back? You haven't liked a single house. My breath caught. He wasn't asking about real estate. I could have lied, played it safe, but I was tired of safe. Because of you, I said, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. His eyes widened, and for a moment I thought he'd bolt. But then he stepped closer, his hand brushing mine, and the world narrowed to just us. I can't, he started. But he didn't finish. Instead, he leaned in, his lips grazing mine, soft and tentative, like he was testing a truth he wasn't ready to face. The kiss was brief, but it burned through me, leaving me breathless and wanting more. He pulled back, his face a mix of fear and longing. I'm sorry, he whispered, then turned and walked away, leaving me standing under the streetlight, my heart a tangled mess of hope and dread. I knew then that Lucas Harper was more than my realtor. He was a man on the edge, and I was falling for him whether I wanted to or not. The kiss changed everything. It was a line crossed, a door opened, and neither of us could pretend it hadn't happened. Lucas avoided me for 2 days, his texts curt, his calls unanswered. I told myself it was fine, that I'd pushed too far, but the ache in my chest said otherwise. I wasn't just hunting for a house anymore. I was chasing a man who might not be ready to be caught. On the 3rd day he called, his voice clipped but steady. Got a new listing. You free? I said yes, because what else could I do? The house was a modest split level, nothing special, but Lucas was different, jittery, his eyes darting everywhere but at me. We moved through the rooms in silence, the weight of that kiss hanging between us like a storm cloud. Finally, in the backyard under a sprawling oak, I couldn't take it anymore. Lucas, talk to me, I said, my voice sharper than I meant. What's going on? He stopped, his back to me, hands shoved deep in his pockets. When he turned, his face was raw, unguarded. I don't know how to do this, Ethan, he said. I can't be what you want. My heart twisted. And what do you think I want? I asked, stepping closer. He flinched but didn't move away. I want you to be honest. With me. With yourself. His eyes searched mine, and for a moment, I thought he'd crack open, let me in. But then he shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. You don't understand what it's like here, what it costs. He told me then, in halting words, about Willow Creek's unspoken rules. About his father, a deacon at the local church, who'd raised him to be the perfect son. Straight, successful, untouchable. About the whispers that followed him in high school when he'd been too close with a friend, whispers that cost him that friendship and nearly his family. I've spent my whole life hiding, he said, his voice breaking. I thought I could keep it buried. Then you showed up. I wanted to reach for him, to pull him close, but I didn't. Not yet. "You don't have to hide with me," I said instead. "I've been where you are. I know what it's like to feel like you're suffocating." He looked at me then, really looked, and something shifted. Not trust, not yet, but a crack in the wall he'd built around himself. The next week was a dance of cautious steps. We kept up the house tours, but they were an excuse now, a way to steal time together. Lucas started opening up, little by little, stories about sneaking out to the lake as a teenager, about the dreams he'd buried to keep his father's approval. I told him about my own past, about the parents who'd called me a disappointment, about the years spent trying to prove them wrong. We were two broken pieces, fitting together in ways I hadn't expected. But Willow Creek wasn't blind. The whispers started, small at first, a glance here, a comment there. The woman at the coffee shop stopped smiling when Lucas and I walked in together. A neighbor asked if I was that new guy Lucas is spending so much time with. I brushed it off, but Lucas didn't. I saw the fear creeping back, the way his shoulders tensed when we were in public, the way he'd pull away if I got too close. One night, we ended up at the lake again, the same dock where we'd skipped stones. The air was colder now, the stars sharp above us. Lucas was quiet, his hands restless. "I'm scared, Ethan," he admitted, his voice barely audible over the lapping water. "I've never felt like this. Not with anyone." My heart leapt, but before I could respond, headlights cut through the darkness. A truck pulled up, and Tom stepped out, his face a mask of fury. "Get in the car, Lucas," he said, his voice like gravel. Lucas froze, his eyes wide with panic. I stepped forward, instinctively shielding him, but Tom's gaze locked on me. "You," he spat, "you're trouble. Stay away from my son." Lucas didn't move, didn't speak, and in that moment, I saw the boy he'd been. Trapped, terrified, desperate to please a man who'd never accept him. "Dad, stop," Lucas said finally, his voice shaking but firm. Tom's eyes narrowed, but he didn't back down. "We're not done," he said, then got back in his truck and drove off, leaving us in the dark. Lucas was trembling, his breath ragged. I reached for his hand, and this time he didn't pull away. "I can't keep doing this," he whispered. "I can't keep pretending." "Then don't," I said, my voice steady. "You don't have to." He looked at me, his eyes glistening, and for the first time, I saw hope there, fragile but real. We stood there, hands clasped, the lake stretching out before us, and I knew we were at a turning point. Lucas was teetering on the edge of freedom, but the cost was steep, and I wasn't sure either of us was ready to pay it. The confrontation with Tom lit a fuse, and Willow Creek felt smaller, tighter, like a noose slowly tightening. Lucas was different after that night. Still warm, still kind, but there was a new edge to him, a quiet defiance. He stopped pulling away when our hands brushed, stopped looking over his shoulder every time we laughed too loudly. But I could see the toll it was taking, the way his smiles didn't always reach his eyes. We kept up the house tours, but they were a facade now. The real search was for each other, for a way to exist in a town that didn't want us to. One afternoon, in a quaint bungalow with a wraparound porch, Lucas stopped in the middle of the kitchen, his hands gripping the counter. "What if we left?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if we just started over somewhere else?" The question hung in the air, heavy with possibility. I wanted to say yes, to pack a bag and run with him, but I knew it wasn't that simple. "What about your life here?" I asked. "Your job, your family?" He laughed, a hollow sound. "My life here is a lie, Ethan. You're the first real thing I've had in years." My heart ached at his words, but before I could respond, his phone rang. It was his father, and the color drained from his face. He didn't answer, but the moment was gone. We finished the tour in silence, and when we parted ways, he squeezed my hand, a silent promise that we weren't done. But the weight of his father's shadow was heavy, and I wasn't sure how much longer Lucas could carry it. The next day, things unraveled. We were at a diner, sharing a booth and a plate of fries, when Tom walked in. He didn't approach us, but his presence was a storm cloud, dark and oppressive. Lucas's hand, resting on the table, twitched toward mine, then stopped. "He knows," Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. "He's always known." I wanted to ask what that meant, but the look in his eyes stopped me. It was fear, yes, but also resignation, like he was bracing for a blow he'd always known was coming. That night, Lucas showed up at my apartment, his eyes red, his clothes rumpled. "He gave me an ultimatum," he said, pacing the small living room. "Come clean at church, or he'll do it for me." I froze, the weight of his words sinking in. Coming out in Willow Creek wasn't just personal. It was public, a declaration that could cost him everything. His job, his friends, his family. I'd been there years ago, and the scars still stung. "Then let him," I said, my voice fiercer than I felt. "Let him tell the world. You don't owe him your silence." Lucas stopped pacing, his eyes searching mine. "You make it sound so easy," he said. But there was no anger in his voice, only exhaustion. I crossed the room, taking his face in my hands. "It's not easy," I said. "But you're not alone anymore." He kissed me then, fierce and desperate, like he was trying to anchor himself. It was different from the first time, less tentative, more certain. We stumbled to the couch, a tangle of limbs and need, and for a few hours the world outside didn't exist. It was just us, raw and real, no walls between us. But when the morning came, reality crashed back in. Lucas's father made good on his threat. By noon, the whispers had turned to shouts. A neighbor saw us leaving my apartment together, and the gossip spread like wildfire. Lucas's phone buzzed with messages, some concerned, some cruel. His assistant called to say clients were canceling appointments. "They think I'm a liability," Lucas said, his voice flat. I wanted to fix it, to shield him, but all I could do was hold his hand as the town turned against him. We went to the lake that evening, needing the quiet. The dock was our sanctuary, the one place where we could breathe. "I don't know if I can stay here," Lucas said, staring out at the water. "Not after this." I nodded, my throat tight. "Then we'll go," I said. "Together." He looked at me, his eyes soft but resolute. "You'd do that? For me? For us?" I corrected, and he smiled, a real one this time. We sat there until the stars came out, planning a future that felt impossible but necessary. A new city, a new start, a place where we could be ourselves without fear. But even as we dreamed, I knew Willow Creek wouldn't let go so easily. Tom was still out there, and his silence was louder than his threats. The final week in Willow Creek was a crucible, forging us closer even as it tried to break us. Lucas's father called a meeting at the church, a community discussion that was really a public shaming. Lucas didn't want to go, but I convinced him. "If you're leaving," I said, "leave on your terms." He nodded, his jaw set, and I saw the man he was becoming brave, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he was. The church was packed, the air thick with judgment. Tom stood at the pulpit, his voice steady as he spoke about protecting the community. Lucas sat beside me, his hand gripping mine under the pew, out of sight but unyielding. When Tom called him forward, Lucas stood, tall and unafraid. "I'm not here to apologize," he said, his voice clear. "I'm here to say I'm done hiding. I'm gay, and I'm in love with Ethan Caldwell. If that's a sin, then I'll carry it." The room erupted, gasps, murmurs, a few angry shouts. But there were others, quieter voices, nodding, some even clapping. A woman in the back stood up, her eyes wet. "You're not alone, Lucas," she said, and I saw the surprise in his face, the relief. Tom's face was stone, but he didn't speak. For the first time, he had no power over his son. We left Willow Creek 2 days later, our belongings packed into a rented van, the lake fading in the rearview mirror. Lucas had lost clients, friends, and his father's approval, but he'd gained something more himself. We settled in a small apartment in Richmond, a city big enough to let us breathe. Lucas found work with a new real estate firm, one that didn't care who he loved. I started a job at a local bookstore, surrounded by stories that felt less heavy than my own. The house we dreamed of, one with a porch and a view of the water, was still out of reach, but we didn't need it. We had each other, and that was enough. Lucas still carried scars, moments when the weight of his past made him quiet, but he was learning to let them fade. I was too. We'd built something new, not just a home, but a life where we could be whole. One evening, months later, we stood on a balcony overlooking the James River, the city lights glittering below. Lucas turned to me, his eyes bright. "You showed me more than a house, Ethan," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You showed me how to live." I kissed him, slow and sure, under the open sky, no longer hiding, no longer afraid. And in that moment, I knew we'd found what we'd been searching for. Not a place, but a truth worth fighting for.